How are you, folks? Dave Brown here with the New Populist. Thank you again for joining me. I have a interesting video for you today. A couple of weeks ago at the Hoover Institute, Condoleezza Rice, who was the president there, she gave a speech or a presentation where she was talking about China and Russia. And what shocked me when I watched her presentation was that for somebody who is a former Secretary of State, as somebody who is universally, even by Democrats and liberals, respected as a stateswoman, I was shocked by how arrogant, how just belittling she was when she talked about these two other countries. And I think this really exemplifies the attitude of the Western elites, where they really view Russia and China as petulant teenagers who need a spanking and who need to be disciplined and brought back into the fold after they say their penance and apologize for their wrongdoing. That's how we look at these countries. And hearing it come from her, somebody who I thought of all the people in the Bush administration was the most measured and mature, hearing her talk about these countries in such a manner, I found to be shocking. So I want to go through about 10 minutes of her speech where she's talking about, again, China and Russia, and break down some of her comments that I go, you're going to say that? You're the former Secretary of State, and this is how you're describing these other leaders? It's, again, really baffling to me that we have this level of arrogance here in the West. So let's start this presentation or speech by Condoleezza Rice.
A second great power, of course, China. Expectations when Deng Xiaoping brought China out of isolation, that China's desire to be a part of the international system was really the best thing that we could possibly do. You know, there's now a lot of criticism of kind of globalization and did you trust the Chinese too much and didn't you see this coming? Well, the real question is what else were you going to do with 1.4 billion people at this point? Were you really going to try to leave them outside the system? So China's invited into the international economy in particular. It accedes to the World Trade Organization before Chinese practices are aligned, so you have continual problems with intellectual property protection. The Chinese cut off large parts of their markets to foreign competition. They clearly privilege national champions over foreign competition.
Let me stop right there. Privileged national champions over foreign competition. Why exactly is that such a terrible thing, that they protect their native industries and native companies? I don't quite get that criticism. But I guess if you're a globalist and you're a complete free trader, you're not supposed to do that.
And this goes on for a while with what I'll say a division in what I'll call the CEO idea about the rising China and the national security view of the rising China. So for a while they're on parallel tracks and they don't really cross. CEOs would tell you in the early 2000s, really up until a few years ago, well, you know, you can make a lot of money in China, it's a big market, you have to be there. And yes, I know that my intellectual property is at risk, but I can protect that. That market in China is too important. National security people would start to see the emergence of a China, even before Xi Jinping, that seemed to be building its armed forces in significant ways that looked like they might actually threaten American supremacy in the Indo-Pacific. In 2007, when I was secretary, the Chinese actually had an anti-satellite test that was tremendously sophisticated and surprised everybody in terms of the level of sophistication.
Now, she talks about China challenging the United States in the Indo-Pacific for supremacy as if that's a shock or, wow, they're doing that? a country like China with 1 billion people, with a rising economy, might want to be the big guy in their neighborhood and push out the United States. I'm baffled that we think our presence there, in that area, should just persist forever, and that China would just simply accept a secondary role. Of course they wouldn't. Of course they would try to push us out. So I'm just mind boggled that we're surprised that they would try to challenge us in their region.
But the presidents of China, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, engaged in something that the Chinese apparently called hide and bide, right? So you kind of bide your time. You don't upset in the international system. At one point, I was getting the Chinese to be in the chair for the 6-party talks on North Korea to try to deal with North Korean nuclear weapons, South Korea, Japan, the United States, Russia, and North Korea. And China was in the chair. And it was hard to get them to actually do anything. Right? They would say, oh, we're just a developing country and so forth. And you think, no, come on, act like a great power. Well, we got our wish with Xi Jinping. They're now acting like a great power. And now you start to see these narratives, the Chinese, the CEO narrative and the national security narrative starting to come together. Because what happens under Xi Jinping is that now there is an assertion that China has arrived and that China ought to be able to engage in its foreign and defense policy as a dominant power, if not the dominant power in the Indo-Pacific.
Now, why wouldn't that be the case? She's not talking globally in the Indo-Pacific. Again, this idea that we're not going to, or China's going to just sit there and not exert itself. Any country would if they have that power, and at some point the United States will have to accept that. But it seems we don't want to do that.
The other piece that starts to come together is that in terms of technology, for the Chinese under Xi Jinping to go out and say, we will surpass the United States in frontier technologies like quantum and like AI, what did they expect? You got a backlash in the United States. You got a backlash because it appeared that this effort to surpass technologically wasn't just because you wanted to build your economy, it was because you wanted to leverage that technological capability to supplant the United States in international power. And people talk about a new Cold War, but there are a couple of really big differences with the Cold War. One was the Cold War was ideological in a way that the great power rivalry isn't. But probably most importantly, the Soviet Union was a military giant, but it was a technological and economic midget. That is not true of China. For the first time, the United States actually has a rival that has economic, technological, and military power to bring to bear on the international system. And Xi Jinping has not been quiet about it. And so you get declarations, for instance, from China that the Taiwan Straits are Chinese national waters.
And on that issue of the Taiwan Straits being Chinese waters, if we are to respect the assertion that Taiwan is part of China, and our State Department does say or says that Taiwan is part of China, that would give them a fairly good claim on those waters. And Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, he sort of let the cat out the bag when he said the issue here was the fact that so much container traffic goes through this area, like 50% of the entire world's traffic goes through here. So if China could assert their authority here and claim these waters, it would give them a huge amount of economic leverage. That is the real issue. The United States does not care about a small island with 20 million people. They care about the strategic advantage it gives China. And I'll also say this, if the situation was reversed, would the United States allow Chinese vessels, battleships and everything, right off our coast, and because of freedom of navigation, right? Would we allow that? Not really. They made a big deal out of the fact that there were Chinese and Russian warships off the coast of our country, when really it was the Alaskan in Alaska. There's an island chain that goes out into the Pacific, and that's where they got close. Not the continental United States, basically uninhabited islands or close to it out there in the Pacific. That's where China and Russia were at, not right on our coastline here in the contiguous 48 states. But we, the United States, we are right up against China in this area.
You get a complete reversion or decision to reverse the 1997 understandings about Hong Kong. One country, two systems doesn't work any longer. Hong Kong is essentially, because of the security laws and so forth, is essentially a province of China at this point. And the Chinese engage in something called wolf warrior diplomacy. Now, there's a tendency with authoritarians to engage in what I call authoritarian envy. Oh, they build great airports. Oh, they're so smart. Oh, the Chinese are so strategic, Sun Tzu, etc. You couldn't have a dumber foreign policy over the last couple of 3 years than Chinese foreign policy.
So that statement right there, the top of my head went, we have the former Secretary of State that was part of the Bush administration when we invaded Iraq and Afghanistan. And, people describe that as one of the worst foreign policy blunders in the history of our country. And here she is talking about how stupid the Chinese foreign policy is. Coming from her, that is absolutely rich. But again, this goes back to our arrogance here in the United States, where this person who oversaw that blunder or was part of that blunder can look at China and go, you guys are so stupid. I don't get it.
Who calls the Australians gum under the shoe of China?
Let me stop there. That was a funny thing. There is a paper in China, the Global Times. The editor, back in 2020, he referred to Australia as being the gum stuck to China's shoe because the Australians wanted to investigate the origins of COVID-19, which I am for, and I do think the Chinese have been very evasive on this issue of COVID-19. I do think it probably leaked from that lab, and the reason why the United States wouldn't admit that was because we were helping to fund it. So we were both sort of guilty there, and both of us had an interest of pretending it was from some bat soup. But this guy who said this is the editor of this paper, and she's treating it like it came from Xi Jinping himself. So anybody who's part of the media complex in China says something, and all of a sudden that is defining for the entirety of Chinese foreign policy, as if these people speak for the Chinese government. And of course, here in the United States, we have the NPR, the UK has the BBC, and we pretend that these outlets that have government funding are independent and that they're not organs of the government. So we have this hypocrisy where we're free here. There is no government or state propaganda, but the editor of the Global Times, well, that's straight from from Xi Jinping if he says something. So that's how we treat their media over there. And yes, China is more authoritarian than we are. And yes, there are more controls on what is said. But this one comment, I think she's exaggerating how important it is.
Who goes to a border with India that's been quiet for 40 years and beats up Indian soldiers with baseball bats?
Let me stop again. Another kind of funny thing here. So China and India have a long border together. There's a lot of disputes on the border. And they have these clashes that have been ongoing for a very long time. The most serious one back in 2020, where 20 Indians were killed when they fell off a cliff, and 4 Chinese were killed. But if you understand the background here, these scuffles happen all the time. And what's funny is that there's sort of this agreement on both sides that in order to avoid escalation, that neither side is armed. So periodically, the two sides clash. They throw rocks at each other. They try to, push each other off cliffs. They, hit each other with sticks. And again, the most recent one that was bad was back in 2020 when 20 guys were killed from India and 4 from China. But again, this has been going on for a while. It's not one-sided. I'm not saying China's innocent here, but both sides have been fighting over the border, and it's been going on for a very long time. And they have this gentleman's agreement that no one brings guns to these fights. You just, beat each other up and apparently shove each other off cliffs. So it's pretty ridiculous. But again, the way she's describing it, like one day China said, hey guys, grab some bats. There's some Indian guys there not doing anything, not paying attention. Let's go up there and beat them up. That's how she's sort of depicting it when that's not really the case. Again, she's too smart to be saying something like that when you can go and figure out what's actually going on, and it's not what she's describing.
And so before long, you start to get a reaction to the wolf warrior diplomacy. Not to mention to Belt and Road, which it turns out the terms aren't so great if you're a recipient of Belt and Road money, and all of a sudden all these countries find themselves indebted. And so we used
Isn't that what
to
we
think the
do?
Chinese would go for what was called loan to own. Right? So if you can't pay back your loans, well, that kind of works in the 19th century. It doesn't work so well in the 21st century. And so China, in its great power dimensions, has begun to flip to a different, not set of principles about what they're trying to achieve, but to the face on it. So all of a sudden now Xi Jinping, it's not wolf warrior diplomacy, it's, we can make peace in the Middle East. Look at what we did with Iran and Saudi Arabia. We're making our peace. We keep talking to Putin about peace in Ukraine.
So she's belittling them for making peace between Iran and Saudi Arabia. That's not a small thing. That was a very significant thing, but because it came from China, you poo-poo it and go, oh, this is just, they're just trying to pretend to be nice. They have no actual sincerity in having peace on this planet. Yes, China has their own motivations and own self-interest, but if the United States is refusing to be reasonable with people across the world, China can step in and negotiate and have these peace deals. And I'm not against peace deals, whoever's brokering them. That's good for everybody. But if you are a American, neocon globalist, you can't allow anybody else to do anything. It has to be the United States, or else it's a threat, and then you talk down on it.
It's a charm offensive now. It's a diplomatic charm offensive. But the underlying circumstances of trying to supplant the United States in the Indo-Pacific in particular, and perhaps globally, continues to dominate Chinese foreign policy.
Imagine that it's dominating Chinese foreign policy for China to be the supreme power in the Indo-Pacific. Again, why wouldn't they do that? It's expected, and I don't blame the Chinese for doing that.
So you have a declining power in Russia that's disrupted the system through a war in Europe that nobody ever thought we'd see another ground war in Europe. You have a rising power, or a risen power in China that's disrupting the system because it's kind of not playing by the rules that we thought it would play by.
The rules-based international order that we have.
The United States finds itself with rivals. Now let me say just one word about the relationship between the two of them. Because the other piece of this has also been, of course, the relationship without limits between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. The bromance between these two authoritarians.
It's very clever,
So,
bromance.
Let's start with the fundamentals. This is an anti-American, anti-Western axis, is what it is. It has very little in shared beliefs, values, except that the West is decadent. and civilization needs to be saved by China and Russia.
Civilization needs to be saved by China and Russia. Have you ever got the sense that China or Russia has indicated that they need to save the world from our decadence? This kind of reminds me of when we said that the reason the terrorists attacked us is because they were jealous of our freedoms. They hated our freedom, so they wanted to come and attack us. When in reality, the reason they attacked us is because we have been involved in the Middle East for decades, causing all sorts of instability. That's not, saying what they did was right on 9/11, but it wasn't about our freedoms. It was about geopolitics and the U.S. involvement in the Middle East. So here she's talking about Russia and China teaming up to save the world from our decadence. No, they're teaming up for self-preservation because they see the United States wanting to contain them, Russia and China, militarily and economically, which is something that we have overtly stated. We are trying to contain these countries to keep them from being strong and having supremacy in the region. That's why they're teaming up. It's not because they're trying to take down the West. That's, again, so she says that here, and I go, what indication have we gotten from them that they're trying to battle our decadence? I find that preposterous.
Has very little in common except that it's both a revanchist China, the restoration of China, of which Taiwan is, of course, the last piece. Russia, the restoration of the Russian Empire, so it's kind of 19th century in both cases. But nothing that binds them culturally. In fact, there are no more xenophobic people in the world about Asians than the Russians. And so the underlying of this is somewhat weak. So what you're talking about, though, is that there's some benefit to being able to jointly deal with the United States. But here's the problem. If you're Xi Jinping and at the Olympics, so let me tell you, I think I know how that conversation went at the Olympics. I've got to do this thing in Ukraine. It'll take 5 or 6 days. You know what it's like because you've got Taiwan. Fine. Just don't do it until the Olympics are over. I think
that might be true. It might have told them to wait.
And now Xi Jinping finds himself wedded to a homicidal maniac who's launched a war in Europe, sanctions all over the place, and oh, by the way, who can't even control his own government and the crazy people around him. By the way, I know those people around him. So I've never met Prigozhin, although I was at a number of dinners which he apparently catered. He's just evil, right? Then there's Patrushev, who's evil and kind of stupid, and according to most people, sort of tied to the Chinese because that's how he made his wealth. And then there's the defense minister, Shoigu, who is just an idiot. All right, I spent a lot of time with him. He's really an idiot. And then you have Gerasimov, who apparently just drinks a lot. So it's not a particularly inspiring group.
So earlier, she was chastising the editor of the Global Times for calling Australia gum on the shoe of China. And here she says that Putin is a homicidal maniac, Gerasimov's a drunk, Putin is also isolated, and that Shoigu, the defense minister, is an idiot. Well, I mean, pretty pointed there. Again, she's a former Secretary of State. She worked with these people. And how diplomatic is that? And then let's add in that Xi Jinping is a autocrat, dictator, bad guy too. So when they, we can launch insults on them, anything that comes back, and that indicates that they are, they have stupid foreign policy and they're unhinged. And look at how she describes the entire Russian government. And she talks about the xenophobia of the Russians. And I'll point out that Shoigu, he is half ethnic Russian, and his I think his father has an Asiatic background. So there's actually Russia has different ethnicities, and can I speak for how well they get along together per se? Because I haven't been there, and so I can't do that. But I think she's exaggerating the extent to which there's this massive xenophobia. Putin has done a pretty good job of having different parts of Russia have some autonomy, and the Russian Federation isn't just ethnic Russians. There's the Chechens, the Dagestanis. Russia's again, it's not just Slavs. It's bigger than that. So I don't quite buy into her characterization.
Around Vladimir Putin, who is more and more isolated, told the truth less and less, and now, as Bill Burns said at something I was recently at, our CIA director, if the emperor has clothes, you better put them on pretty soon, because everybody has seen what has happened with this mutiny. So you're Xi Jinping, and this is your relationship without limits.
So that is the clip from Condoleezza Rice. Again, very condescending, very belittling, very little respect for those two governments. And there's this notion, too, she talks about this relationship without limits and talks about how they have nothing in common. We seem to have this idea that perhaps we can exploit this and pull the two apart so they stop cooperating and divide and conquer. We seem to think we can do that. And I asked the question, do you think Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin are so stupid to allow the United States to pry them apart, isolate them, and defeat them each, one at a time? Are they that stupid? Is Joe Biden going to lead that effort to do that? And oh wow, man, we beat them because these two guys who have been in control of their countries for a very long time somehow fell for that trick. Well, they are both fighting for in their viewpoint, their survival. Russia thinks that there's an existential threat by the United States and NATO, which is why they're fighting in Ukraine. And China knows that we are trying to use Taiwan against them for economic reasons. And that is a key, Taiwan, for China and their power in the Pacific. So both of these countries know what the score is. And they're not going to be fooled by our clever leaders who might split them apart. And certainly Condoleezza Rice is not that person. And of course, she's not in government anymore, but she does, unfortunately, represent some of the thinking. And I go, no wonder the Bush administration was a foreign policy disaster because of people like her. And because she's a woman of color, I think people have a more of a tendency to want to like her and not want to think of her as being, not necessarily evil, but not what she seems to be. And but sometimes, people tell you who they are, and you listen to her here. I go, I can't believe, I ever thought that perhaps you were a good stateswoman. You have arrogance and no respect for the people that you are supposed to be negotiating with. And Tony Blinken, unfortunately, is not much better than the current Secretary of State, where he went to China and that went very terribly. And they had to dust off Henry Kissinger and send him there to try to smooth things over because he's actually a person who does respect the Chinese and doesn't talk down to them. So American arrogance, and it sucks to say as an American, that's how our country behaves, and it doesn't seem that that's going to change anytime soon. Well, that is it for now. If you are new to my channel, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.